Good evening, teachers and educationists. A very warm welcome to you all. I am Priyanka Mukherjee from Cambridge. Presence in 170 plus countries and a legacy of hundreds of years. Cambridge University Press and Assessment's mission statement is to contribute to society to the pursuit of excellence in education, learning, and research. We explore, we collaborate, and we innovate to spread knowledge, spark inquiry, and aid understanding. And our team is one connected unit pursuing excellence and moving forward together. Teachers of Tomorrow is our endeavor to connect, collaborate, and learn from each other, as well as seek guidance from the experts in the education domain. Does that platform to learn from each other, to learn from the best, and most importantly, to focus on the implementation of that learning. We are extremely elated to have with us Mr. Joseph Cubas. He is the co-founder and current head of Avsara Academy, an institution that spearheads the dream of creating the next generation of women leaders, challenging the proverbial glass ceiling. His stellar repertoire includes his stint as the Director of Institutional Advancement at the American School in Mumbai and as a special assistant to the Superintendent of Government Schools in New York. Today's topic, I believe, will resonate with all of you because today's topic is focusing on those instructional practices which fosters engagement and deepens learning. So without further ado, I would request, sir, the floor is all yours. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Priyanka, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us this evening. And thank you for the Teachers of Tomorrow platform for bringing us all together so we can learn from one another. Hopefully, by the end of our 25, 30 minutes together, you do have some additional ideas of how to foster engagement and deeper learning in your classrooms and in your schools. I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit more about Avsara Academy, in particular, the learners that we work with. And so the first thing is that we are an all-girls school, as you can see by this beautiful photograph. We work with students in grade 6 to grade 12. We do not have a primary or pre-primary section with us, and that was a strategic choice. It is also true that 90% of the students that we work with come from low-income backgrounds. This has very much been a part of our mission and vision since we founded the school 10 years ago. It is also true, right? Because we take students mostly in grade 6, that nearly all of our students do not come from or come from non-Cambridge schools. The vast majority of our students are coming from state board schools, and a few of them are coming from CBSE or ICSE school. And a third characteristic of the learners that we work with is that they are all second or third language English learners, right? And so I wanted to share these characteristics of our learners because I really believe that context is very important when deciding on which strategies you want to bring to your learning environment, which techniques you want to try to implement. We always have to meet our learners where they are. We have to understand who they are. And once we understand their strengths, we want to choose practices that can help build upon those strengths. And what this really often requires, it requires a lot of learning and homework on our side, right? To go and find those strategies and practices that are going to be most effective with the learners that we're working with in the context that we're working in, right? So before we share a different example, I just want to put this idea out there that context is really important when implementing whatever strategies you learn. I also want to point out that the different techniques and strategies and practices that I'm going to share, there is a research base for them. Most of the things that we do, we try to find a grounding in research in around learning and how learning happens best. These are four resources that influence our use of the practices that I'll be talking about. Just very quickly, over on the left-hand side, I think many of us would be familiar with Professor Hattie's work in visible learning. Uh, Second, over to that is a resource by Doug Lemov. It's called Teach Like a Champion. And it's a collection of techniques that have come from observing hundreds of classrooms and thousands of teachers across a network of schools in the United States. There's actually a version 3.0 now. The third resource here is it's called Principles of Instruction by Barack Rosenshine. And that resource has synthesized 10 principles of instruction that come out of review of neuroscience literature, classroom practice observations, and cognitive science and literature review as really where those 10 principles are coming from. And then lastly, over on the right-hand side is making thinking visible. And this work stems from Harvard's Project Zero, where they have like this beautiful list of visible thinking routines that they've put together and shared with everyone. So this is just a bit of the resources that went into that informed the practices that we've adopted at the school. Before we get into the practices, one final piece here is it's a disclaimer, and I think it's something that we know, but nothing works everywhere, right? Just because a particular strategy works with the learners that we worked with at Upstart Academy doesn't necessarily mean that it will work for the learners that you're working with in your school or in your school systems. That being said, there is like everything works somewhere, right? So if a particular strategy doesn't work in your classroom, perhaps it may be of use of another colleague in a different classroom at a different grade level and a different subject. So I think there is a home for every strategy. And this last point here around research is it's more of a caution. So we, of course, should be using the most current research-based practices in our classrooms and in our schools. But I think we should approach them not in a checklist kind of a manner where we're just simply doing as the research tells us. I think we have to pick and choose the strategies and techniques that we think are going to work best with our learners. And once we've chosen them, we have to implement, observe, reflect, refine, and re-implement, right? So that we're using our reflections and the data we've gathered from version 1.0 to inform version 2.0 to inform version 3.0, right? So it's an iterative process. It's not simply just taking something from a book and putting it into a classroom and then not thinking about it again, right? So just a few things to think about before we move ahead. And so we'll move into the first practice that I'd like to share, and it's called replace self-report. And so self-report happens when we ask a binary yes/no type question at the end of a period of learning. So it could be a mini lesson, it could be a reading from a particular text. And so we sort of pause and we say, does everybody understand? Everybody got it? Do you have any questions? And so this is a very binary yes/no question. And these, the literature, it says that these are not very helpful questions to pose. And there's a couple of reasons why. But in terms of the experience, usually, most often people will just respond yes, or they'll be silent when the question is put to the group. And the sort of yes or the silence is particularly frequent when such questions are posed in a large group, like a classroom setting, 25, 30, 40 students, right? And there's a couple of reasons why that response emerges. First, on the cognitive level, like we're asking learners to do a lot in a very short period of time, right? Because usually when we ask these questions, we only wait for 15, 30, maybe 60 seconds, right? And we're asking learners first to synthesize everything that we just presented in the last 15 minutes. Of everything we just presented, pick out the one or two, three things that you don't understand, and then articulate your misunderstanding in a way that I, as the facilitator, will understand what you have misunderstood so that I can help you, right? There's a lot of work we're asking someone to do in a very short period of time. And that's very challenging, I think, even for adults. to do, let alone students who are learning something completely new and different, right? The second thing is there's a social dynamic at play, and this is sort of internal and external. On the internal side, there may be fears or worries or concerns around embarrassment. Why am I the only one who has a question, who doesn't understand? But also, like I think young adults and children are looking beyond themselves and saying, I do have this question, but I don't want to stop everybody else's learning, so I'm not going to ask my question right now and try to find out and clarify it later. But usually that I'll go and find out later doesn't happen, right? So these dynamics are at play, and I think these, to a good extent, and for other reasons, right, lead to sort of this silent response to these questions. And I think it's important to note that, like, we as facilitators, um, in asking this question, we're doing something right, right? Like, we are acknowledging to ourselves that it makes sense to pause at this particular point in time when we ask this question to the group. But we're missing an opportunity, and we often fail because we're not gathering enough data that can let us know whether learners have understood what we have just shared with them, right? And so, in replace self-report, what is it that we can do to replace self-report, right? And I don't think this will be a super surprise to everyone, but we want to use frequent checks for understanding to gather sort of authentic data on what students have understood. And I'll share some examples of the kinds of information that we can gather, mostly in terms of questions or tasks that we can pose to students. And so the first is we can ask students to paraphrase and repeat instruction. So we've finished a period, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes of direct instruction, and then we want to have students work independently. We've shared a set of instructions, and before students actually get to the doing of the task, we can ask them to paraphrase or repeat the instructions for us. Of course, if they're on the screen or they're written on the board, we should try to make them not visible, so students really have to recall from memory. CFUs, we can also ask for simple knowledge and comprehension questions from what has just been covered. Can someone tell me the formula for X? Can someone tell me the definition of this word and this word? Right. So we're trying to use the CFU to make sure that the key concepts, processes, components of what we just covered, students have been able to capture them. We can, sort of move to a little bit higher level in simple recall and ask for a summary, right? So we're asking students to now synthesize and pull out what they think are the most important things from a particular length of time of instruction. Could be the last 15 minutes, could be the last 3 days, right? So we can also play with the time period of the summary. We can ask students to push thinking, right? And we can ask students if they agree or disagree with our answer as the facilitator. So sometimes we presented an answer to students, or depending on the culture of your classroom, right? If it's safe to do this and everyone's comfortable, we can have students agree or disagree with other students' answers. And what's important to really uncover the understanding is to ask the question why, or to have students show us their process, or to have students share evidence with us. Another way we can check for understanding is we can ask students to think aloud while pursuing a task. So if we invite a student up to the board and they're solving something, we can just ask them, as you solve, please talk, right? Maybe if a student is working on a piece of writing, we can have them talk us through their outline before they write their outline and then eventually write their essay, right? We essentially want to get whatever's happening up here in the mind out verbally. And we can ask students to explain or defend their position, right, by asking why or what evidence has led you to that particular conclusion, or what process did you follow to come to that answer, right? So we want to replace self-report with multiple checks for understanding. These are some types of checks for understanding that we can put in place. And what I'd like to do now is I just want to pause for 60 seconds, not very long, because we have a lot to cover. And I would request the participants in the chat, if you can share some examples of checks for understanding that you have used or you think you can use with the learners that you're working with, just so that we can broaden the pool of ideas for us. And so I will start a timer and give us exactly 60 seconds to add to the chat. Questioning, that's right, different types of questioning. Ask for students for their point of view, and we have to ask why they have that point of view. Very nice. Yes, we can do short quizzes. Um, it- Very often CFUs, I think if best if they're not graded or kept in the grade book, we can open up what if scenarios. Uh, we can use doodling. Yep, four corners, exit tickets, mind maps. These are all wonderful ways to check for understanding. Yeah, we can ask for summaries. Yep, group discussions, but like we have to observe, right? So we see what's being said. Yeah, exit tickets have come up a lot. That's right. Okay, great. So you can continue putting things in the chat so that everybody has those available. I'm going to move ahead just in the interest of time. And so the next practice that we follow very consistently at Upsara is providing thinking time. And so I'll talk a little bit about thinking time more broadly, and then two ways that we can structure thinking time. So I think we would all agree that everyone needs some time to understand a question, right? When a question is asked, you need a little bit of processing time. Even when I just gave the instructions in the chat, it took maybe 30 seconds for the first response to come in, right? So we need to understand what the prompt is before we can reply. Providing thinking time gives that time for processing ideas and developing responses to a prompt or a question. Thinking time is especially important, and perhaps more of it is required when we have learners working with new information and flexing new skills that they've just learned. For the first time or like very close to the time that they've learned them. And I think another benefit of thinking time is it helps with pacing, both for students and for teachers, right? So that thinking time allows students to sort of catch up to everything that has just happened. Depending on what we ask students to do during the thinking time, if it can be observed by us, either in writing or through a conversation between peers, we can also get a sense of where students are. And that can tell us, do we need to revisit something that we just went over and to help ensure everybody understands, or can we move ahead, right? So it does, how you monitor the thinking time can really help with pacing in both directions. So two techniques, strategies, practices for thinking time. The first is called a stop and jot. It's a processing activity that gives students the opportunity to record their response to a prompt. So this is a time where all voices are silent and everyone is sitting and writing something, excuse me, in their notebook or digitally on a device. Stop and jots are great because they can be used throughout the life cycle of a lesson. So they can be used before a lesson to activate prior knowledge, right? The prompt that we use can ask, tell me all the things you know about cell structure, right? Because we need to know the cell structure for what we're doing next. During a lesson, it's part of this section because it can provide that thinking time for processing information. It can also be used as a check for understanding, right? As students are writing, if you move around the room and observe what they're writing, you can get a sense of where all the students are. It can be a tool and provide time for students to summarize things that have been spoken, right? So I think very often verbal communication is the quickest, simplest way to introduce something or get information across. And so having this time where we stop and have students summarize what's been spoken can be very helpful. Can also be used as a transition between different parts of the lesson. After the lesson, we can use it as a reflection technique, right? So now we're all going to stop for the next 5 minutes and write down um, how we felt or what's important from the lessons or the unit that we just learned. We can use it, if you think about something like a mind map, which was mentioned in the chat, we can use it to capture ideas or critical pieces of information. Depending on the prompt, we can also use it to help learners connect what they're doing today with material that they covered last week or in the last unit or even the previous grading period. And lastly, stop and jots can also be used depending on the prompt and how you set it up for students to make connections between what they're learning in the classroom and their lives outside of the classroom. So stop and jot, a very useful technique to engage students during that thinking time. A second strategy technique is think, pair, share. It's a cooperative learning activity where the facilitator poses a question or gives a prompt. Students first think to themselves, right? And then they have a chance to discuss it with a peer, usually someone next to them. And then finally, the pairs would share out to the entire class. So the sharing part is the whole group share in a think, pair, share. Think, pair, share is a wonderful strategy because it allows everyone to have a chance to think. If you go directly into discussion, someone else may speak before you speak, and sometimes their thoughts, their ideas influence what you think, right? So doing a think, pair, share where everyone's thinking and thinking independently allows everybody to formulate their own thoughts. When you move into the partnership, right, it's an opportunity for someone to rehearse their response before sharing with the whole group. So maybe you have a learner who's a little reluctant to share to the entire group, and this provides a smaller forum for them to practice before they speak to the whole group. It really can be used in every classroom. I think as a strategy, it's most often associated with language learning context or reading context, but it really can be used science, math, history, like any subject. The whole group share, it could be me sharing like my personal response that I shared in my partnership, or the facilitator can ask each pair to share a summary of what both people have discussed. A little bit of a tip or something that can happen is if you really want to encourage active listening and you're concerned about equal amounts of talk time, you can let students know that at the end of the pair, when we share to the whole group, we're actually going to share my partner's response instead of my own response. So it really activates close listening. And the other thing too is, even though it's not required, we can encourage students to write their thinking down, or they can draw their ideas and put it down on paper before even sharing it with a partner, right? And so again, we'll pause here. We'll give ourselves another 60 seconds. So this practice is providing thinking time, and we shared two ways that you can do that. You can do that in a stop and jot, or you can do that through a think, pair, share. There are many techniques that one can employ during thinking time, and I'd love to hear from everyone which other techniques have you used to provide students with thinking time. We'll give ourselves 60 seconds and then we'll move ahead. Yep, see, think, wonder. It's great. And often there's a graphic organizer, right? With the see, think, wonder. Yes, many of the visible thinking routines start with what an individual thinks, the KWL charts. That's right. So that's a graphic organizer. You know, the group discussion, like I think with the group discussion, you have to put a little bit of time for people to think before the conversation starts, right? And the same thing with something like brainstorming. You want, if you're going to ask for brainstorming, you want it to first be individual and then take it to a group. 2 stars and a wish. I would love to hear more about that. I haven't heard of that. 3, 2, 1 bridge. Yep, another one. Okay. So there's a lot of, yes, using chits. That's right, to construct. Okay. Our 1 minute is up. So I'm going to move ahead. Again, keep throwing some of these ideas in the chat for everyone to see. Next practice is replace self-nomination. So self-nomination is when learners volunteer to respond to a question or share their work. This most often is done by asking students to raise their hand, right? So we give a prompt or we ask a question and then we say who would like to share, and so students raise their hand. What's problematic about only using self-nomination is it limits teachers' information about the class, right? If I'm only able to get responses from a very few number of students, and it's also a missed opportunity for further inclusion in the classroom. And so I'll take these last 2 points together. It is often the case, right, that the same students raise their hands most frequently in class. And so if I'm only taking answers from the same students who frequently raise their hands in class, I'm only understanding what they have understood, right? And theirs are the only voices that are coming into the room, right? And so if we use other strategies besides volunteer, right, and self-nomination, then we can get a wider sampling of what students have understood, and we can include more students' voices at the same time. And so to help us replace self-nomination, we would use a strategy named cold calling. And I'll spend a little bit more time on this one because there's a couple different steps here. And so it's a pretty straightforward process. So we, over here on the left-hand side, we ask a question or we give a prompt, right? And as we just discussed, we give some thinking time, right? So it can be it can be a stop and jot, it can be a turn and talk, it can be a think, pair, share, it can be a KWL chart, right? So we give some thinking time. And after that period of thinking time, then we as a facilitator, rather than asking for volunteers to raise their hand, like we just choose students or learners to respond, to share their response to the prompt or to the question, right? Now, there's a couple of different ways we can do that. So we can do it completely randomly, and I'll talk more about the complete random option. We can preview the cold call in different ways. So one way we can do that is we can do a pre-call where I pose the question, right? So my question is, what is the meaning of life? And then I indicate which learner is gonna give the first response. So what is the meaning of, this is your question, take 5 minutes to think and write down what is the meaning of life. And then Joseph, I want you to share your response to that prompt after the 5 minutes are up, right? So we do a pre-call so the learner knows that they're gonna go first. Second option is we can batch call. And so that's really calling out a sequence of students that would share their answer. And that can be employed in lots of different ways. Either we have students answer question 1, 2, and 3, or we have students, there's only one question and we're asking student A, B, and C to all share their responses to that question in a sequence. And the next step is responding to the answer. And the important thing here is that it's a genuine interaction and response, right? So if the answer is correct or incorrect, we shouldn't leave it as yes, that is correct, no, that is incorrect, right? We should try to understand a little bit more of the students' thinking. So yes, that's correct. Can you give me the reasons why? Yes, that's correct. What evidence did you use to come to that conclusion? Yes, that is correct. What process did you follow to get to that answer, right? And if the response is not what we were expecting, right? We can probe the student a little bit further or probe their thinking a little bit further and ask them, okay, so what was the first step that you took? Do you think that was correct? What was the second step that you took? And you can maybe ask other students about the different points in the process and what they may have done differently in the process. So there can be an exchange there. You'll have to judge how long that exchange should happen, but we should definitely not leave it at yes, it's correct, no, it's incorrect, right? And then we go to the cycle again. Two additional points about cold calling. So the first is that cold calling is really meant to be strategic, right? So you should be thinking about what responses do you want to bring to the entire group? So for example, let's say you've had students reply to a prompt, and as you're moving around and you're reading what students are writing over their shoulders, and you recognize that there's two very different points of view that students have come up with, right? You may want to strategically put those 2 points of view to the entire group, right? So that students can see that, yes, these are two different opposing points of view coming out of the same reading or the same piece of evidence, right? It could also be the case that, two students have come to the correct answer, but have different solutions, right? And so we want to raise awareness that we can have two different solutions and still come up with the same answer, right? So we want to be strategic. Another strategy or another thing that cold calling could be helpful for is perhaps you have a learner who you've had to provide some additional support for, and like they were able to get to the answer that you were looking for successfully on their own, and so you want to cold call them and give them the opportunity to share that with everybody else as sort of a private celebration between the two of you that yes, we've been working on this, and yes, you've done it right, and so please share that with the group, right? So there's a lot of strategic choice behind cold calling. Now that being said, there still is the option to randomly cold call. We randomly cold call an officer quite a bit using the popsicle stick method, and it's not that it's wrong to do that. Um, we do it quite frequently. It's just that if we only use the random method, then we lose the opportunity um, to highlight some of these very interesting um, some of the interesting diversity in our classrooms when it comes to responding to a particular question, right? So we want to replace self-nomination with cold calling. And it's not that hand raising, you should never use hand raising and hand raising is never good. When I taught math class, I definitely use both. It's just hand raising shouldn't be the only way that students are able to share their responses to a prompt. The fourth practice and the last practice that I wanted to cover is daily review. And simply put, we should be beginning every lesson with a short review of some previous learning. And I'll talk about what that could look like and what the time frame could be. So we should begin every lesson with some previous learning, with a review of some previous learning. This helps with recall of words, concepts, procedures, formulas, practice, right? Like it's just um, it's introducing many short practice opportunities to help build mastery over time, rather than just trying to have a lot of practice in a short period of time, right? Sometimes we have to be able to put things in our long-term memory so we can recall them 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years down the line. They don't have to be very long. It should be 5 to 10 minutes at the most. They are typically ungraded. It's just practice for practice, right? Intentional practice, but practice, ungraded. And so daily reviews can take various forms as well. And by forms, I mean both the actual physical form. It could be a Google form. It could be any technology tool. We're asking students to solve different problems or respond to different prompts. There's lots of electronic tools that would be helpful for daily reviews, or it can be simple chits or simple things that we're asking students to write in their notebooks. And so one is the form, and then the second is the content, right? Like what kind of content should be put or could be put in a daily review. And so I want to talk a little bit about the content here. So some suggestions. We could use that 5 to 10 minutes to correct some of the homework, right? So we don't need to, if it's a long piece of homework, we don't have to correct all 15 questions. We might just choose one or two that we want to ensure that all students understand the solutions to those one or two, right? And the part of the power of correcting homework or reviewing homework in class is that it sort of doubles on working on students' metacognitive skill development. Second, possible content for a daily review is simple review of concepts and skills, right? So it's just practicing something that students might have learned last week, like the last class, the day before, the previous week, or even the previous unit. All right, so it's always good to circle back to the most important things that we need students to carry forward. We can build our daily reviews around points that students themselves have identified as ones that are difficult for them, right? So through like an exit ticket, for example, that was shared earlier, we can get a sense of students, things where students have misunderstandings or lack of clarity or have some doubt. And then we collect those, and then we address those in our daily review in the next day or in a future daily review. We can also use, we have a collection of data on our students. We have formative assessments, we have summative assessments, we have anecdotal data, we have observational data. So we can also build into our daily reviews, review of topics that students, based on the data that we've collected, there are frequent errors in there. And the last one is we can use daily reviews, to review material that needs overlearning, right? So overlearning is this idea that we practice something so much that it becomes second nature to us, right? And so for all of our subjects, there are different things that students just need to know, and it needs to be automatic, right? And so these are the things, these types of content or skills can be things that are included in our daily reviews. And so we'll have our last sort of stop and jot for this session, give ourselves another minute or so. Um, Again, I don't think daily review is a completely new practice, but what is other content that you could put in a daily review or you have put in a daily review if it's part of your classroom routine? Concept checks, that's right. Formulas, yep. Yep, recapitulation or reviewing things, formulas. Could be a daily reading around an important and a key idea. A class test or a quiz is something that you might want to keep separate, right? If it's going to be graded, all right? I wouldn't put a class test or a quiz in the daily review. Concept map could be helpful, that's right. Like having students fill out a concept map so they can make different connections. Different fact checks, right? Um, Definitions of vocabulary. Yep. Mind map is a good tool, is a good structure to use. Yep, it could be, you know, a 4 or 5 question worksheet, key terms. Yep, some challenging questions, right, that you notice students, many students were unable to answer as expected. Yeah, key takeaways. Maybe you can do some fill in the blanks, right? So people can fill in the blank, students can fill in the blanks of key takeaways. Yeah, micro test. Again, ungraded. Okay, lots of good ideas here. As again, I'll move ahead, but keep putting those into the chat for everyone. So those are the 4 practices. In summary, we suggest and we have, and it's part of our practice at Upsera to replace self-report with frequent checks for understanding, right? That provide sufficient information to the facilitator in the room on where all the learners are. Provide thinking time, right? It could be with a stop and jot. It could be with a think, pair, share. It could be with any number of the strategies that were shared in the chat when we put that prompt up there. Just to stop, let students process and think, and so that they can make connections to the things that are coming ahead. The third is replace self-nomination with cold calling. Like I said, it's not that raising hands should be stopped completely, but we shouldn't rely only on raising hands. I think it puts us as facilitators at a disadvantage. And I think it's a missed opportunity to get everybody's voice in the room. And so we should add cold calling to our classroom strategies and incorporate daily reviews in every lesson, right? Just to have those opportunities for students to practice engaging with key skills and key concepts in our subject. So those are the 4 strategies. I went a little bit over time. I'm sorry about that. And so the presentation is done. If we still have time for questions, we can take those.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it was a completely insightful and engaging session. There's a lot of engagement, as you can see, sir. Lots and lots of appreciation coming your way. And please, audience, feel free to share your queries. Sir, we'll take a few queries. First question that has come is from
Yes.
Dr. Ejaz Ahmed Mir. He's asking that is it better to ask questions to students individually or to ask group question so that they may discuss with each other and maybe be able to understand other things too?
Yes. So I think you uh, I think it really depends on what it is you're trying to achieve, right? I think I'll give you in from my experience, right? So I taught grade 6 math last year, and in my experience, I think you would pose the question to the entire group, right? Then you would give, if you're using stop and jot or think, pair, share, then you want to give the entire group some amount of time, 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, to think about the question or think about the prompt on their own. And then after that thinking time or wait time has happened, then you want to let everyone know that the sharing time has started. And so the first part of the sharing time is to share with your partner, right? So the a peer sitting next to you. You could extend this to a table group, I would say no more than 4 students. But you can then say for the next 3 minutes or the next 5 minutes, we're going to share our answers or our responses with our partner. And then after we share our answers with our partner, I'm going to take five we're going to share 5 responses with the whole class, right? So in terms of stop and jot and think pair share, we're posing the question to everyone, right? Um, having everyone work individually on their thinking, processing, and writing, and then if we want to take it to the entire group, then we share with the entire group. I hope that helps.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of more only, sir, in the interest of time. Ramu Chikkala asks, what is the best way to start a new concept?
Oh wow. I my suggestion would be like I think when starting something new, we really have to first very well understand where students are, right? And so whatever it is that we can do to know where students are in preparation for the introduction of that new topic or that new concept, um, we have to do that, right? So that maybe that understanding already exists because we have assessment data, right? Um, and so even in the apps, even with that assessment data, perhaps we can start that um, that introduction of that new concept with maybe a busting exercise or a question generating exercise, right? Where we say, now we're going to be learning about this. What So one way to do it is, what all do you know about topic X, right? So then you as a facilitator get to know what all knowledge is in the room. If you already have that data, right, because you have previous assessments and things like that, another thing you can do is to say, okay, so we finished with Y, and now we're going to begin X. What are some thoughts, questions, ideas, misunderstandings, myths that you have about X? We gather those, and then we make sure that as we move through the learning of that particular concept, we're addressing those questions or busting those myths. I think would be two different. I mean, of course, we can just jump right into the new concept, but if the question is around like what alternatives might there be to just starting a new concept, those might be two suggestions, right? So we start with trying to bring to light any prior knowledge. If we know what the prior knowledge is, then we try to grab questions or myths or misunderstandings so we can address those and correct those.
Thank you, sir. We'll take two last questions, sir. One, I'm combining two questions, and both are on similar topics. That is, teachers are keen to know how do you address the differentiated learning abilities in a classroom? Uh, there are children who are on the spectrum. There are children who do not respond to questions. How do we have a classroom where both sets of students who are doing exceptionally well and who are struggling to cope can have a space where they feel engaged? I'm just combining two questions here.
Sure. So the first thing that I want to be very transparent about is that I have no special education training. We do not have. I have not been in schools where students with very specific learning needs have attended, and so therefore there are programs in that school to support those learning needs. So it's very difficult for me to comment on uh, a very broad cognitive diversity being in the same classroom. Um, and so I don't know that I have like very specific responses to that. One thing that I do think and believe is that if we can incorporate strategies that enable students to work on tasks independently, and that can be perhaps with some guided independent work. And if we can provide opportunities for students to um, share their work with one another, get feedback from one another, um, before having to take that to the entire class or take that to larger groups. Um, I think those strategies in general um, are helpful, right? Like, how is it that we can with whatever time that we have, with whatever resources that we have, how is it that we can uh, provide opportunities for almost kind of personalized or individualized learning to happen, um, given the resources that we have, given the space that we have, given the knowledge and training that we have, right? Is something else I would suggest. I'm sorry, like I wish I had more expertise in this area to provide like very clear alternatives, but I do not.
Thank you so much, sir. I think there's a lot, like, there are too many questions, which is a wonderful sign that everyone is engaged, everyone has thoroughly taken a lot from the session, sir. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I just saw that there's one last, I just came across one question that I want to answer very quickly
Sure.
before we go. Is it possible to use these practices in every lesson for AS and A level subjects? I wouldn't say every lesson, but it is absolutely possible at AS and A level. So these 4 practices are followed in all subjects from grade 6 to grade 12. And so that's IG in 10th and AS and A level in 11th and 12th. So you will see daily reviews, even with all the pressures to cover the syllabus. These things are built in there, and daily reviews in particular are a big part of AS and A level instruction, because a lot of our revision has to happen uh, in those 5 to 10 minutes of daily review, right? So if you think of revision not just happening once the syllabus is complete, but sort of mini revisions that are happening throughout, you can use that daily review time for that. And the stop and jots and turn in talks, the stop and jots and think pair shares are also used quite frequently at IG, AS, and A. So very much so. You have to figure out how it's going to work, but it definitely can work. Sorry, Priyanka, back to you.
So, sir, thank you so much. I think wonderfully insightful session. There's a lot of intense participation, wonderful questions coming up. So I cannot thank you enough, sir, for having conducted this really interesting and engaging session and come and sharing some practical tips, most importantly, which can be implemented in the classroom. Number of questions are coming in. Dear participants, the recording will be shared and will be available to you shortly. Meanwhile, I'll be very keen to share a couple of resources with you all, which Sir has shared, so that you can access it. I'll just share the links on the chat. You can refer to these links, to get additional information. Thank you again, sir. Thank you everyone for joining this session. I would request you please take a look at the Teachers of Tomorrow platform. There are lots of opportunities to collaborate with each other, to learn from each other, of course. And we have Sir and similar educationists on the panel. So please feel free to join the Teachers of Tomorrow website and the platform. Sir, thank you again. Thank you, everyone, again for joining in and for sparing your time in the evening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. The slides and the presentation will be available on the as a part of the recording and will be shared to you soon. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, sir.
everyone.